Thanks for being here. Thanks for your attention. This is James Loftus. He's going to introduce our big speaker. Give James a hand. Here he is.
Wow. It's a large, I think this is by far our largest crowd. But I'll share with you, it was the fifth graders at Kingsley Air Base that have given us the best questions so far. My name is James Loftus. I'm the director of JPL Museum. I wash dishes for my wife at the Gardner House Cafe and Bed and Breakfast in Staten, Oregon. And it's because of her that I get to do all of this, because she's the engine behind our business. I have a few artifacts I'm going to hand out to you. I thought I'd share with you that my father retired after a 47-year career at NASA as the assistant director in charge of life sciences. And so I inherited a great deal of precious national resources. So one of these is a piece of the International Space Station. It's a solar cell. So you can pass that around. Please make sure it gets back to me over here. And then the second object is a piece of the Apollo 11 command module heat shield. So I want you to imagine that you're coming in at 25,000 miles an hour, that your rear end is about this far away. You're watching this melt like candle wax across your windshield. And you're hoping to God that the team that put that spacecraft together, because you're on the last part of the journey home, did it right. This was done by a large number of individuals working together to accomplish a single purpose. So please pass that around. Why am I here? Why am I here? It's a rhetorical question. But each and every one of you are going to ask that question of yourself. Why am I here? What is my purpose? You're still young. You're not as old as I am or old as Norm. So I'm going to share a little wisdom that I've learned. And maybe you can observe it in your own life. But I've noticed that there's two types of people in this world. There's those that when they walk, they look down. And that's all they see. And then there's that look up. And they see the beauty and the smiles and the nature around them. They look up into the sky and they see the stars. And it fires their imagination. And so I want to share with you, my friend Norm Chaffee is a man that looked up into the stars, put a man on the moon, a robot on Mars, and the International Space Station into orbit. Norm, with that, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you, James. I'm so pleased to be here at North Medford High School. I've got a little laryngitis, but we're going to fight through it here. This is the most impressive venue that we have talked at during either last year's trip or this year's trip. Mr. Black and the school has just a wonderful job of populating the pictures around here of things that I'm going to talk about. And he's going to project some pictures of the Apollo spacecraft that I can use to show you the little part that I worked on, the little piece that I owned and was responsible for. So we'll get there in a minute, but let me give you a little bit of information about myself. I'm a chemical engineer. I have a bachelor's and master's degree in chemical engineering. I went to Rice University in Houston. We went back to the University of Tulsa for graduate work because I wanted to go into petrochemical type work, refinery type work. I was raised in Oklahoma. All of the engineers that I knew pretty much worked in the oil business, and so that was the focus that I had. I was one of the nerd kids that liked math and science. I understood chemistry. It just seemed to come natural to me. I understood physics, and the other kids would say, "God, do you understand how to balance this equation?" I said, "Yeah, it's easy. Do you know how to do that?" Well, yeah, I do. So, and even I add this to to the story, even 25 or 30 years into my career at NASA when I was up in middle management, and I knew NASA guys all over the NASA network at the other centers. There were 5 or 6 times I got calls from a good friend, said, "Hey Norm, this is Robert or Jack or something, and I'm trying to help my daughter or my granddaughter balance a chemical equation. I'll be damned if I can do it. If I read it to you, can you help me?" So I was getting, requests for a little chemical input even well into my professional career. I was always interested in science and that type of stuff. My parents were very good. They bought me a microscope when I was little, and about 5 or 6, and we went to the park and got pond water, took it home and looked at that under the microscope and saw these little things swimming around, amoebas and paramecians, and they were, splitting and trying to eat each other and all this things of that nature. Later on, I got a telescope, and we went out, and the night sky was still fairly dark in Tulsa in those days, so I got familiar with the galaxies that you could see, the Magellanic Cloud, looking at the moon, could see a lot of details, could see most of the planets, could just barely make out the rings around Saturn, and if you got a real clear night, you could see 4 little spots about Jupiter, which were the largest moons of Jupiter. So I was really always excited about space and dreaming about going into space and going to the moon and going to Mars and going somewhere with a lightsaber to protect the Earth against the aliens and that kind of thing. But I knew that was just science fiction. It was fun to read about, fun to think about, but wasn't ever going to happen in my lifetime. And all of a sudden, on the 4th of October, 1957, something happened that changed the world and changed the arc of my life and my career when the Soviet Union launched the Sputnik satellite into orbit. And so it was a little 14-inch diameter basketball with 4 little trailing antennas. Went around the Earth in orbit about 345 miles high, and it did nothing but go beep, 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 beep. But if you had a little ham radio, you could dial in that frequency and you could hear it going over. And so if you translated that beep, beep, beep from Russian into English, what it said was, look what the Soviet Union can do and the United States can't. And if we can launch a beep, 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 maybe in a year or 2, we can launch a much bigger boom, boom, boom. And you're not going to be too happy about that. And that was the truth, and that started the space race. And so we were off and running. The United States was trying to launch satellites and had been having disastrous consequences. But shortly after the first Soviet Union launch into orbit, we got a launch into orbit from the U.S. Army. Werner von Braun and his team of Germans came through and put a satellite up for the United States. So it was a time of excitement, and I got more and more interested and said, well, maybe this space thing is going to be real. Then the Soviet Union launched Yuri Gagarin into office. He did into orbit. He did one orbit, came back down, and that was followed by the establishment of the astronaut corps for the United States. And about 8 months later, we launched John Glenn into orbit. We previously launched Al Shepard and Gus Grissom, but then John Glenn went into orbit, and boy, there was a real human space program that the United States was going to have. I was really interested at that time. I was just completing my graduate work, getting my master's degree, getting ready to go to work for a refinery. I actually did go to work for a refinery, and then I heard that the new agency called NASA was going to establish the center that was going to manage and direct all of the human space work at a place called the Manned Spacecraft Center in Houston, Texas. Well, that's where Rice is, and I thought, man, I've got to get involved in that now. So I love Houston. It's down in South Texas. It's warm down there pretty much all the time. You're 30 miles from the beach. You can always get fresh shrimp and fresh, oysters and crabs and fish, that type of thing. So talked with my wife and we made the decision to see if I could get hired down there. I was successful, called them up. I told them I was probably one of the most brilliant young chemical engineers in the country, and I needed to come down and work for them, and somehow foolishly they believed me. But they hired me at about the same pay that the refinery was paying me, so we got in our old car and headed south, and in the, this thing picking up, all right, okay. And on May the 13th, 1962, we rolled into Houston, and I'm still there working as an unpaid volunteer. I retired in '98. Went to work for about 12 years for a contractor, continuing to support the space program, and then I was always working also in education outreach. That became something that was much more interesting to me than the regular NASA work, and so now I continue doing that. And Mr. Loftus has been nice enough to invite me up last year and this year to come around and talk to various schools. So this is a great place to work. I started out working on the last Gemini, or last Mercury flights, worked on the Gemini program. When I got there and walked in, they said, "Mr. Chaffee, you're now a rocket scientist." And I said, "Hey, okay, well that sounds great." I remember in advanced thermodynamics doing a homework problem on rockets one time, so I probably know everything I need to know about that. Well, that was also wrong, but I quickly learned, and at the end of about a year of a very intense study and work, I also had a machine shop that I could work with and a rocket test facility. So after about a year, I really was a rocket scientist. I worked on the Gemini. We started very early working on the Apollo program. So we've got a picture of the Apollo 5 launch vehicle that you can see up here relative to the height of the Statue of Liberty. This thing is 36 stories high. As it sits on the launch pad, it's all full of propellant. It weighs 6.8 million pounds. And what my job was as a rocket scientist was not the big engines on the bottom of the first stage, or the big engines on the bottom of the second stage, or the single engine on the bottom of the third stage. My responsibility was right up here at the top where the spacecraft is, and so I was going to build the rocket engine. It turns out that the booster engines, the very large things, the 1.5 million pounds of thrust each. Here you get up here, second stage you got 5 200,000 pound thrust engines. Third stage has got 1 200,000 pound thrust engine. But the steering rockets for the spacecraft right up here are 100 pounds thrust. And James, we brought one here off of the service module. You can hold it up and walk around, let everybody
Be the model.
let everybody see it. So if you look here at a picture of the side view of the Saturn V with some ID, I'm way up here. This is the service module. This little conical thing is the command module, or the crew road. There's a conical piece, you call this the frustrum of the cone. That's where the lunar module was stored on the launch. But the little engines I've designed, built, tested, and proved would be capable to do the flight were on the service module and on the lunar module. So they're 100-pound thrust engines. They generated there were 16 of them on the service module, 16 on the lunar module, so a total of 32 on there. And the interesting thing is that the propellants are identified up here. The propellants are are monomethylhydrazine, nitrogen tetroxide, and unsymmetrical, where does it say that, unsymmetrical dimethyl hydrazine, some rather exotic chemicals, but they work very well in the little steering rockets, because the job of the steering rockets is to change the velocity of the spaceship in plus or minus x, plus or minus y, plus or minus z, and then to rotate the spacecraft in roll, pitch, and yaw. So they fire very short bursts of these exotic propellants, which are hypergolic. You don't need an igniter. They just squirt together in the combustion chamber and immediately break into flame. The combustion temperature is about 5,400 degrees Fahrenheit. If you keep the valves open, the temperature of the combustion chamber will steady out at about 2,800 degrees Fahrenheit, and it'll be an incandescent white, be so hot. At that point, it's radiating away the same amount of energy that's being input into the wall on the inside from the combustion chamber. So these little engines have a very high efficiency, but what we want to do is to move around. We don't need to move fast generally, so we fire in very, very short little pulses. And this little engine that Mr. Loftus is holding for me, 100-pound thrust, is designed to fire anywhere from 14 milliseconds pulse, which is a little out to just turn it on and let it go. You can fire the entire contents of the propellant tanks out of it if you want to. But to save propellant, we generally, if we're moving, we only need to move very slowly. And so we fire typically 14 to 20 millisecond pulses, whatever the computer tells us. And so that's a completely different type of engine than the booster engines that people are used to thinking about. The propellants are toxic. You don't want to get them on you, or you don't want to breathe them, because that's bad news for your health. But if we would have a visitor come down to our test facility, and we would do a demonstration firing of these little engines, we do a countdown: 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. That's it. And the colonel or the ambassador or whoever was down there would say, "Oh, it didn't work. You didn't fire it." We said, "Oh yes, ma'am. Look at the oscilloscope here. You can see the pressure wave goes up and comes down within 14 milliseconds." So that was a big surprise to most of the visitors that came down. But typically the kind of firings that these engines did were, put, 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 put. And frankly, that I can do for you here as a demonstration is not a 14 millisecond. It's more like a 50 millisecond, because I can't do a 14 millisecond. So, but when you leave here, you can try and see if you can get to 14 milliseconds. So I worked on the Apollo program. Later on, I also worked the propulsion systems on the International Space Station, on the Space Shuttle. You've got a Space Shuttle hanging up back over here in the back, and there are rocket engines on the front and the back. That thing is so much bigger than the Apollo that now the size of the thruster had to be about 1,000-pound thruster instead of a 100-pound thruster. So we went boom, boom, boom for a 40 millisecond firing. So you can later on go back over there and look at the Space Shuttle orbiter and look at where those engines are located in the nose and on the back. So I got to work on a lot of interesting rocket engines, and did actually become a fairly good rocket scientist. Later on, I was asked to go over and be one of the chief engineers on the International Space Station, figure out how to divide it up into chunks, in what order should those pieces be launched and connected, and how would we make sure that every time you added a new piece of the space station, of course it would change the weight, it would change the center of gravity, we change the moments of inertia, we change the amount of energy needed, the amount of heat rejection needed to keep it cool. So you had to do a complete design analysis each time you added a new piece to the space station. The space station that's up there now is 330 feet long, 300 feet wide, 90 feet thick, weighs 1.1 million pounds. It goes around up around 225 to 240 miles above the Earth, where the drag is very low. And we think that it will stay up there until 2027, 2028. And then the government is thinking about, well, it'll be time to build a new one, and so we don't know how long it will last. But they had a good time doing what you call systems engineering on the design of the International Space Station, and particularly in figuring out what's the sequence that we build this thing as. Here you can see the solar arrays, the little pieces we were sending around. I'll let you look at was from an earlier version of this, the solar arrays. All the electricity for the International Space Station comes from the solar arrays and goes into a set of batteries, so that when you go around on the dark side of the Earth and you're not getting any sunlight, you pull your energy out of the batteries, and then when you come around back in the sun, you got the solar arrays generate the energy that you're using while you're in the sun, and then a surplus to go into the batteries, so that when you go around on the backside, you pull the energy out of the battery. These white things are radiators, because all of the electric energy that you use inside the modules here generates heat, and the crew generates metabolic heat. You have to get rid of that heat. We use a glycol water system, and it goes out to these radiators, and that's what cools the International Space Station. So I worked on that at the very end of the 80s. I was in charge of lunar Mars exploration, trying to figure out how to go back to the moon, to stay and to work, and be there in significant numbers, and then how to go on and do the first exploration of Mars. Now that was a lot of fun. Thinking about that, planning, trying to identify the really long poles in the tent that we had to overcome in order to do that. But the Congress wasn't interested in paying for that back in the 1988 to 1990 timeframe. So I had an opportunity to move on to a new challenge at that point, and was deputy chief of automation and robotics for NASA in Houston at that time. And that's an example of a career move that I would talk to you kids about frequently. Your boss will come to you and say, hey, Joe or Francis or Margaret or Bill, I've got this opportunity. I'd like you to go over and do this new challenging job. And in my view, the answer is almost always yes, sir, or yes, ma'am. Let me have 2 or 3 days to think about it, figure out the resources and the help I'm going to need to be successful, and then come back and talk to you about that. And then if your understanding and my understanding is the same, you betcha I'll go do that job for you. And so I think that's a good philosophy. Occasionally there may really be something that you don't want to do, like hey, Margaret, we want you to lead this suicide charge against the Bohemians or something like that. Hey, no sir, why don't you get Ralph to do that? So I got to work for 6 years in the robotics field. If you're in FIRST robotics, we helped start in the local Houston area school district called Clear Creek Independent School District. Their first team and our engineers helped them, and they were allowed to come to NASA and build their test, what do we call it, square that you build where you go have the competition. They were Team 118, called the Robonauts. And the Robonauts have historically been a very good team. And they're named after a dexterous robot that I helped develop and build. That's actually on the International Space Station right now as an astronaut surrogate. So it could go out and do many of the things that an astronaut can do, or be an astronaut helper, you know, holding things still, handing the astronaut tools, picking up a part that has just been unscrewed, and then you know, putting in a new replacement part, that type of thing. At the end of that period, I got tapped again, saying, "Hey Norm, we got another job. We'd like you to go off and start the biomedical engineering group, and there's a doctor going to head it up, but he needs somebody who's an experienced manager who knows how to build an organization and recruit staff and get a budget and all that kind of stuff." And I knew very little about biomedical engineering except how to take my temperature and things of that nature. So, but I went over and did that for about a year and really enjoyed it, learned a lot. And at that point, I had the opportunity to retire. I did, and have consulted for a number of years, and then have gotten into this education outreach stuff. So that's kind of my story. So I got to look at my notes now and make sure I get everything in the hour that we got. Let me talk about the advance of technology. So James, if you'll hold up my computer that I used from high school all the way through Rice, Tulsa University, and my engineering for Mercury, Gemini, Apollo, up through 1974, when I got my first four function calculator. This thing is called a slide rule, and some of you may know what a slide rule is or how to use it. You may have a father or a grandfather who had a slide rule, but that, you know, it does multiplication, division, takes things to exponents, or takes roots. And so I can do very complex calculations pretty quickly with that thing and get about 99.5% accuracy. And of course, if I need accuracy greater than that, I go to the digital computer of the time. This computer has no requirement for a battery. Its digital storage is 0 gigs, but it works really very well. The only thing you got to be careful is don't let the slide come out and get lost, because then you're done. So we've got a picture up here now of Robonaut. So this is when I was the 6 years I was in the robotics division. This is the robot, dexterous, intelligent robot that we built in-house in our own laboratories, and then have developed a partnership with General Motors and the Department of Defense, and now we have built one which is on orbit in the International Space Station. So the head here, he understands human language. He's got a vision system in here, little TV cameras, so he can see things. He's got motors. He's got a shoulder joint that he can have 3 different degrees of freedom. An elbow joint operates just like a human elbow. A wrist joint that operates just like a human wrist. And the thing I was working on was the development of the hand, because the hand has so many different degrees of freedom. Look, just think of the number of different kind of grips you in the course of a day have to have. You get up in the morning and you grab your toothbrush, you grab a glass of water to rinse your mouth. You may have to reach down and grab a pill that you take. Your comb is a different grasp. When you go to eat breakfast, you grasp the fork and the knife and the spoon all differently. So you have to be able to configure your hand and your 5 fingers a number of different ways. And building all of that into the robot, writing the software to do it, and then coming up with the motor, little motors and that type of thing was really an interesting kind of job. And I had one young engineer that I actually sent over to the Texas Medical Center for about a 3-month internship over there to work with the hand and arm surgery department. He came back with so many great ideas about how to do this that he was really responsible for the ultimate success. But evolution and the good Lord, whichever one is in charge, has really done an interesting job with the tendons, ligaments, and muscles of our hands. So stop and think about that sometime. So we could go. Yeah, can we put the Apollo launch vehicle back up there?
Better believe, yeah, coming right up.
I also worked as a chemical engineer working on rockets and power systems. Was a lot of fun because this rocket I was showing you, I blew up several of those on the way to coming up with the right idea, and it was always when that happened in the test facility, it's always an oh shucks, except I didn't use the word shucks. An oh shucks moment when it blew up, because within 10 minutes the chief engineer of the center was calling to find out what happens, and then shortly after that, one of the astronauts who was keeping track of what we were doing would call and say, "Hey, Norm, what'd you do? When are we going to get that fixed?" So there was a little bit of pressure involved, but we did figure it out. So when this thing goes up, have we got the one that shows the drawing of the? There we go. So first of all, when we want to light the engines down here, the F1 engines, we have a little explosive device that lights the kerosene and the oxygen called a pyrotechnic initiator. And Mr. Loftus is holding it up. It's about the size of the last joint of your little finger. And so we got those things in all of the main engines down here to light the kerosene and the oxygen. And 168 seconds later, when that's all done, we don't want to carry this first stage any further. We use pyrotechnic materials to just cut all the metal, let the first stage fall away into the ocean. Don't want to carry that dead weight. We use those devices to light the second stage engines. When it's all done, pyrotechnic device fires a shaped charge. It falls away. When it's gone, we light the third stage engine and so on. So all as with stages do their jobs, we cut them away, let them fall back into the ocean. In the case of the third stage, it takes us finally into orbit and then sends us off to the moon, and then we get rid of it too, and it goes into a separate orbit about the sun. Then we've got those devices all through this thing. So it was a lot of fun working on explosive devices too. A chemical engineer likes to work on fire and smoke and explosions and things like that, as long as they are the effect that's intended. It's when the unintended fire and smoke and explosions happen that is most exciting. So I had a great career doing a variety of things that I really learned about. My greatest moment, my best memory of the Apollo program was not the landing, it was Apollo 8. And it was the first launch to the moon on the big Saturn V launch vehicle with a manned crew up here in the command module. It happened right before Christmas in 1968. And so we launched on December 21st. We successfully got into Earth orbit, lit to the third stage, went to the moon, got captured into lunar orbit And right just before midnight on Christmas Eve, they were stabilized in their lunar orbit. They had successfully entered lunar orbit. All the switches were in the right position. The data all looked good. And Commander Frank Borman, rolled the spacecraft around so that the new high-definition color TV camera that was looking out the front window was looking down the vector that the spacecraft was flying. So I don't know, we got that picture. There's one kind of across the way there that shows the Earth hanging up above the lunar surface. But I think that's from another flight. This probably is the Apollo 8 thing. So it got up there right at midnight, and I was on duty in the control system, watching all the propulsion and power system data, making sure everything was okay. The first pictures came up of the lunar landscape rolling up before us. It was very almost colorless. And there, I think here's Bill Anders talking about it. But you could see the craters in the hills and the mountains, but there was not much color in the surface. Occasional, it was mostly very light, off-color white, a little bit of yellow, a little bit of brown, black once in a while. Suddenly on the surface, out here ahead, we could see a little bump coming up, and everybody said, "Wow, what is that?" It's white, but now look at, there's some blue and there's some green, and finally somebody said, "Hey, that's the rising Earth." So for the first time, from about 60,000 feet above the lunar surface, we were seeing the picture of the rising Earth above the moon instead of the moon rising above the Earth, as we had done for millions and millions of years. And so that was an amazing sight for those of us that have been working on the program. And at that time, Frank Borman, the commander, started reading from the first chapter of Genesis. In the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth was without form and void, blah, blah, blah. So just the emotion of successfully having gone into lunar orbit after all the years of work, for the first time, seeing up close the lunar surface and its features, seeing the Earth come up in its relationship to the moon, and then hearing this quote from the Bible was just, for me, a very emotional time, and I think that's my most impactful memory of the Apollo program. The second, of course, was the actual landing by Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin. I was not on shift at that time. I was at home right in front of that big TV screen with my two little kids sitting on my lap. I think one of them was 7, one of them was 4. And I was telling them, "Now watch this. This is something that has never happened before in the history of the humankind. It's the first time humans will ever land on the moon. I want you to remember this all your life." And they're squirming around and, "Oh, Daddy, I don't want to watch it. I want to go play with the dog or ride my bicycle or something like that." So I tell them, "Shut up, watch some TV." So they're all now getting both close to 60. They're 55 or 58 or something. They say, "Hey, man, we remember that, Daddy," but I don't know whether they really do or not. So here's kind of I guess this is an animation of them coming in. It looks like Gene Kranz. Maybe that's Gene. He's a friend of mine. He's the guy that came up with the failure is not an option. So they landed on the surface of the moon. Here's my little engines out here that are steering them. And as we descended, then the computer took them a little long. They were going to come down in a boulder field. So Neil Armstrong arrested his descent, hovered a little bit, and then used the little engines right up there and right there to move sideways about 100 yards, and then went ahead and sat down. And just as we were getting low on fuel, a call came, "Contact, we're on the surface." And then Neil said, Houston, Tranquility Base here. The Eagle has landed. So see all these boulders? So he went over here somewhere where it was smooth and sat down. Here he comes in. He's kind of moving sideways. He's hovering, and now he's gonna come on down over here somewhere. Anyway, he was getting low on fuel, and there was a mission rule that said if your fuel gets lower than so much, you got to abort and go back to orbit and come home. So sitting there with my kids on my lap, but I was able to hear this conversation between the propulsion controller and Gene Krantz, and I was really getting puckered up. I was really tense until I heard that contact, and then the engine's off, and Neil said, we're on the surface. The Eagle has landed. So that's my second best moment. Let me give you a sense of the way technology has changed our lives and how fast it's moving. In 1903, two bicycle mechanics from Dayton, Ohio, who turned out had lived briefly in Oregon at a little town called Sublimity. They had gone to Dayton. They were very successful bicycle mechanics, but they were interested in heavier than air aircraft, which nobody had ever been able to do at the time. So Orville and Wilbur Wright, in late December 1903, went to Kitty Hawk, North Carolina, and demonstrated the first powered flight there. They flew about 200 feet in a successful powered flight. And 66 years later, in 1969, the human race put two men on the moon and brought them back safely. From 200 feet to the moon and back in 66 years, with all the technology required to do that, just amazing. In my own lifetime, Sputnik going up in 1957, which changed the life of lots of kids like me from doing something to, wow, let's go to space, let's be an astronaut, let's do whatever. So from Sputnik in October of 1957, look what we've done. We have gone to the moon and landed and come back. We have visited every planet in the solar system. We have landed on several of them. We've landed on moons of Saturn. We've landed rovers on Mercury. Got several rovers that have landed on Mars, some of which are still active. We have gone beyond the solar system out into the cosmos. One of the things I was going to show you, and your teacher, Mr. Black, has a picture of the Hubble Space Telescope. So there have been a series of fancy telescopes that went up. I love the Hubble and its pictures. So the astronomers that were looking at those pictures said, there seems to be some areas of the sky in which there is nothing that we're seeing, and we don't quite understand why that is. So they arranged for the Hubble to look at a very dark piece of the sky, and you can kind of see it up there, but the area that you're talking about that they looked at for 10 days is the size of a grain of rice held out at your arm's length. So above the tail of Ursa Major, the Big Dipper, and when they got the picture back, they said there appears to be nothing there, and you can see that the picture they've got was, this is the picture they got back. And I think I've been told if you count all of the very faint things, even ones you can't see here, there were like 10,000 pieces of light. There's one that's very bright, and I can't remember. It may have been up here, and they blanked it out. But it was a star in our galaxy, the Milky Way galaxy. And every one of these other things is another galaxy. And as you know, galaxies have anywhere from 200 billion to 400 billion stars each. So just in that tiny little piece of the sky, look at all of the galaxies, some close, some further away, some we're looking directly at, some on the side. Just fantastic. Here's one that's tilted a little bit, just, you can't imagine the immensity of the universe, you know. So when people ask me, do you think there's other intelligent life out there, I say, well, I've got no proof, but intellectually, I think with the number of opportunities that there are for life, it's highly unlikely that in our little obscure piece of the universe, life is the only, this is the only place where life as we know it has come about. So I think there's lots and lots of life out there. We don't yet know how to communicate on with devices that go faster than the speed of light. So for instance, this galaxy out there, which looks like it might be a little closer because it's bigger, you know, it may be 2,000 or 5,000 light years away. So it would be real hard to communicate with those folks. But the way technology is going, there may be a way to figure that out. And you guys, in your lifetimes, will see some amazing things that you can't even imagine, just like I can. You know, if somebody had showed me a smartphone in 1955, explained all the functions it could do, I'd kicked them in the rear and said, man, you're just pulling my leg, you know, there's no way anything could do that. So maybe by the time you guys are 80 years old or so like I am, you could really do beam me up Scotty and things that we just can't even imagine other than as a science fiction kind of thing. So, but in your lifetime, because President Trump now is a great space program enthusiast, he wants to go back to the moon and on to Mars. So I think other presidents that follow him will also want to do that. So in your lifetime, I believe you will see people going back to the moon to work and to stay in large numbers. And when you're 60 or 70 or 80 years old and there's a new moon, you know, we're just a sliver of light. If you go out in the evening with a pair of binoculars and look up in that dark part of the moon, it's not illuminated by the sun, you will see 2 or 3 little spots of light, and that's places where humans will be living and working, and it may be your grandchildren or your children will be up there, and maybe you yourself will be able to go. Also, I think by 2040, we will have had the first humans on the moon, on Mars. But you guys are going to see technologies and things happen that I wish I could hang on for. But every time I talk to a group like this, particularly groups that have really outstanding facilities to study and teachers, I know that some of you inevitably are going to be in the space exploration business, whether you're going to work for Elon Musk on SpaceX or work for NASA, whatever. Some of you are going to be doing things like I did. And I always wanted to last until we got to Mars. And they say, well, we're going to get there in the late 2030s. Well, I'll be 100 years old. So I'm planning to last that long. But you know, if the program slips a little bit, I may not make it. And so, yeah. And so what I would like to do is, if any of you all end up on Mars, or your children or your grandchildren, tell them as one of the early activities they do, they put their suit on, because Mars has no atmosphere, basically. You have to go out with a suit on. Go out, find a sharp stick or sharp object or something, and write Norm in the dust on the surface of Mars. I'd like to be memorialized that way, even if it only lasts 15 seconds. So let's get Norm on Mars and at some time in the future. So James, you tell us about Phil.
All right, so up here, if you have a chance before you leave, we have Phil. Phil is number 174 of the Project Mercury chumps. And he was donated to our museum back in April. which sent me on a odyssey to try to find his story. And I was fortunate enough to get a hold of Bill Britz. He's 93 years old. He scanned in his personal journals, and he, in the process, says, "Oh, you know, I remember Phil." And I said, "Well, can you share a story with me?" And he goes, "Well, I got to preface it because, you know, it sounds kind of crazy, so let me tell the story of Phil." These guys, they were lieutenants, so that's like being a freshman, and they got a new commanding officer. He was a colonel, so that's like a principal. And so the colonel came to him and said, "Anytime these chimps have been stressed, I want a 10-minute watch started, and I want you to notify me." And he never explained why, and he was kind of secretive about it. But the lieutenants figured it out. The colonel was going in after 10 minutes, and he was bringing a banana, a can of Coke, and a cigar. And he would give the chimp, in order, the banana, the can of Coke, he'd light the cigar, and give it to the chimp. Now these chimps were very smart. They knew sign language. And they liked to play games, so he would play tic-tac-toe with them. And sometimes he'd intentionally lose so that the chimp would feel good. And so the chimps would beat their chest and, you know, ho, 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 have a good time, and he would leave. And these lieutenants thought, "Man, this guy, he's crazy." So about 4 months later, he is part of the Great Escape. He and about 16 female chimps are now, you have to imagine this, so you've got about 20 chimps running across the New Mexican desert, followed by 200 air patrolmen trying to capture them. The colonel picks up Bill in a Jeep, and they do this flanking maneuver, and they get out ahead of the chimps. And the colonel turns off the engine, and they're just sitting there in silence. And the lieutenant's thinking, why aren't we going after the chimps? We should be chasing them and trying to get them. And he said it couldn't have been more than a minute that the chimps crested over the sand dune. That colonel jumped up. He popped that can of Coke open, and those chimps stopped dead in their track. They look at each other. They look at the colonel. They look back at each other. And the race was on to see who was going to get the Coke. They all crawl into the Jeep. They sit down. They cross their legs. They open their hands like this. And the colonel puts cigars in them, lights them up, and these chimps are like kings. They're sitting in the Jeep as they drive back towards the cages, and the females all turn and follow them back. At that point in time, the lieutenant realized the guy was a genius, that he had a plan, but he didn't bother to share it with them. He didn't understand why. So what I want to try to share with you is that you're going to come up as you grow up with a lot of different good ideas. And they're only ideas as long as they're in your head. The moment you put it down on paper, it becomes a plan. And if you have a plan, you can share it with other people. And they might be smarter than you in other areas, where they can help you develop that idea and improve upon that plan. But if you don't get it down on paper and you don't share it, there's no way for it to happen. In your life, you have to plan it out. Nobody else can. And there's only one person in this room that can tell you, you can't do it. And that's you. I can't do it. I don't want to do it. I don't have the qualifications. Let me tell you something. It's your attitude. It's how you look at things as to whether or not whatever's in front of you is an obstacle. So with that, I would like to thank you. If there's any questions, we still have like a minute or two. And I hope you guys have learned something. Any questions? Yes, sir.
Is it for Norm?
Yeah.
Okay. I want to know if, say you could choose to be born like in our generation, would you rather have worked what you did before with all of the Apollo missions, Mercury and all that? Or would you rather work on stuff today like going to Mars and
All right, so the question is if you could be born now versus when you were, did you, I guess, appreciate what you've done, or would you rather be at a point where you can put a man on Mars?
Both.
I'd like to live to 200.